They talked it out. They didn't go to their, tribes and yell at each other and leave. They actually had to figure something out, and they did, and they produced this amazing document.
I'm less worried about our country sliding into socialism. I'm worried about kind of a plutocracy that we've got going on.
We're at another 80-year inflection point if the pattern holds. Revolution, 80 years later, Civil War, 80 years later, World War II, and now here we are right now in the 2020s.
Welcome to Bourbon and Rum, the podcast dedicated to civil conversation. I'm Kent, I like rum, and I'm from the left side of the aisle.
And I'm Kyle, I like bourbon. I tend to be a little more conservative. We're brothers talking politics over bourbon and rum.
What are you drinking?
Well, I mean, for this episode, I had to go to my old favorite, E.H. Taylor. How about you?
I'm drinking a Dominican rum, Brugal Anejo. So cheers. And cheers to our guest.
Here, to Randy DeSoto. Welcome, Randy. Looks like Randy is drinking clear water, as I can surmise. So that's good.
Yeah, I have water. I got to keep sharp here.
That's right. Well, hey, everybody. We are hosting a guest tonight. We're hosting Randy DeSoto. Randy is a journalist, a lawyer, a veteran, many things. He's had quite a career. He graduated from West Point, served in the Army, and then proceeded to get a law degree. We're not sure why. He might have a screw loose if he's a lawyer, but no, he got a law degree, and then he became a journalist, started writing for this publication called the Western Journal. It's it's a conservative news site, and read many of your articles, and you've written about 4,000 articles over the last decade or so, and recently wrote a book. He wrote a book called "We Hold These Truths," and we'll let you obviously get a better description of it, but just to kind of summarize, one of the things he kind of brings forth in this book is that the people that founded our country did so on some founding principles. And a couple of those are, one, that there's a God that created us, a creator, hence the reference to the creator in the Declaration of Independence, and that our rights come from God, and there's this objective kind of moral order above human government. And I think, for our listeners, some of the conversation that Kent and I have had over the years is we often get into differing opinions, and a lot of times those differing opinions go back to the truths, if you will, that we hold evident. And I think as we look at the political spectrum and we see people of different ilk and different viewpoints, sometimes it traces back to a core belief structure deeper than the topic at hand of the day. But as we get into this, one of the things that I found was particularly relevant to what we're trying to do in our podcast about having civil dialogue is, the people that came up with this document, the Declaration of Independence, was a bunch of folks that had a lot of different viewpoints. And they came together and had a discussion. They talked it out. They didn't go to their, tribes and yell at each other and leave. They actually had to figure something out, and they did, and they produced this amazing document. So, I'm not saying we're going to build a Declaration of Independence tonight, but I think what we're trying to do in our podcast is just that, have people from different walks of life and be able to converse. So with that introduction, Randy, I'll turn it over to you. I mean, can you give us a little more color there?
Yeah. So this is the book, We Hold These Truths. And I'm pleased to point out that it's a bipartisan book. It's got I've got John Kennedy and Reagan next to each other. Of course, Lincoln, Jefferson. So, and then others, Frederick Douglass. So, yeah, I'm of that mind too. I'm a conservative, but I certainly try to be fair. And I loved the John Kennedy years, and there of course there have been other great Democrats through the years. He's my favorite Democrat president probably. And then FDR, of course, he's a big star in the book. He's got his own chapter, and So I guess just to give a broad overview, the book goes through. It's called "We Hold These Truths," and I look at three major eras in U.S. history, which are undeniably defining moments in U.S. history. So you got the Revolution. Of course, we're in the 250th year of that, the Declaration of Independence, and then the Civil War, where I say liberty was carried forward, and then World War II, where we passed it on, and of course, many nations even before that were modeling their governments and their ideals from the Declaration and our Constitution. And then I look at today a little bit, in the last two chapters, where communism, socialism, how our founding ideals stack up against that and what they have to say about that. And for my work at the Western Journal, I did interview Charlie Kirk a couple times, and I covered his events. That I live in Phoenix, and although I'm in Pennsylvania right now, where my families are from, but so I included some significant Charlie Kirk content in the last chapter, what he has to say about socialism and God-given rights. And so, yeah, that's the big overview of the book.
So interesting. Why World War II? How did you come to that being the pivotal point versus something like 9/11 or other instances like that?
Yeah, people have pointed out to me, and of course, people have a theory about the 80 years in human history. In U.S. history, there seems to be a major turning every 80 years, and I didn't plan it that way when I picked it out. I went to West Point, and of course, MacArthur, Patton, Eisenhower, they all have their own statues there. My room was right by MacArthur's room, one of the semesters. So those people loom larger than life at West Point, and. But I think it's undeniable that the United States came out of World War II as a superpower. And the same wasn't true after World War I, where we kind of jumped in at the end. And we were certainly a rising power as the early 1900s. But we were kind of the last man standing, and standing tall at the end of World War II. And we were able to take our ideals and move them, and implement them really in Japan and Germany as part of the occupation force. So in that sense, it was liberty passed on. So I feel like that you can't get around the fact that after World War II, the United States was not the same nation it was, when we went into it. And so I think, but yeah, there is something to say. We're at another 80-year inflection point if the pattern holds. Revolution, 80 years later, Civil War, 80 years later, World War II, and now here we are right now in the 2020s. But I think that's interesting in itself. But yeah, and it does seem like we're at a definitional inflection point. Like, how much government do we want now? Is socialism realistic? And it's not like we haven't had these debates before. Certainly socialism was big in the early, say 1910s, 20s, 30s. Communism was a big deal in the 30s, and the Red Scare in the 40s and 50s really. But so it's not like we haven't had these debates before, but it feels kind of fundamental now when you compare like a John Kennedy to what the likely Democrat candidate will be, say in 2028 or even in 2024.
Well, and so, I mean, Ken and I talked about that all the time. I mean, the Republican of today is probably not a whole lot different than the John F. Kennedy Democrat of John F. Kennedy's days. I mean, the parties, there's a lot of drift for sure. I mean, I talked to a lot of people who are anti-Trump, but they're like, well, I'm a Republican. And they're like, well, they're a Republican of maybe 40 years ago, but a lot of things have changed and shifted.
Yeah, no, I think, I think that's true. Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting, Reagan, the president that he quoted the most during his first term was John Kennedy. So, and because he was trying to get his tax cuts through, and Kennedy was a tax cut advocate, and he was of the theory, the FDR model had been more government spending stimulates economic growth, and certainly that happened during World War II. We were spending a lot, but we were borrowing a lot to make that happen, and so John Kennedy, I think, rightly saw that if we could lower the taxes, it would incentivize people to, for one, it would put more money in the hand of consumers. And if you lower the taxes on businesses, as they did also under his plan, although Johnson ended up passing under Johnson, but it was Kennedy's idea. that you'd have a bigger economy, and you would have money to help those in need. And actually, the government ran a surplus at the end of the '60s after the Kennedy tax cuts. So I think it validated, and we were in the middle of the Vietnam War, and we were able to still pay for both things. So that's something to be said of that.
It's amazing. Turn back the clock a little bit. Talk about the founding in your mind, because that's a term that gets kind of quick referenced, sometimes without a lot of nuance about what constitutes the founding. Tell me kind of your interpretation. How do you frame that in your mind? What happened in 1776 in Philadelphia?
Well, it's interesting. Thomas Jefferson, the way he kind of gained a platform, if you will, if you want to put it in today's terms, is that he wrote the Summary of the Rights of British America, and that got wide circulation in the colonies. And so his argument was, and I think the founders' argument was, starting really, say, 1765 with the Stamp Act, and then building up, was that, hey, we're the same as if we're living over in England, and you're not treating us the same. We have, we're supposed to be represented when taxes are imposed, and so we shouldn't have this faraway government imposing taxes on us that we have no say in. And it's not like they wanted just like one or two reps there to represent the colonies when they could be outvoted by the British people. They wanted their own governments that were accountable to them. And so that the whole push of the revolution was to establish the fact that they were equal, and their equality was based on the idea that the rights that the British had come to recognize over the year with the Magna Carta and their own Bill of Rights and all that stuff were the same. And if you look at the founding documents and even the Declaration of Independence, that's what they're trying to say, is that we're the same as you guys, and you should treat us the same, and you're not. So, yeah.
Well, I think that's interesting because, the sort of mythology around it is that this, and indeed the fact is that we created this functioning republic, but I think you hit on something interesting. Do you think they had a conception that they were starting something unique in human history? I'm kind of going to the exceptionalism thing. Do you think that was in their minds, or was it more like you described? Like I just want the same rights that a British citizen who lives the UK under the Magna Carta has.
No, I think it became that. I think it started to grow into that. So I think that first decade and up to the Declaration and stuff, it was just trying to secure the rights that they'd always had and recognized as British Americans. And then, but it became bigger than that. And at the end of the Revolutionary War, Washington wrote a letter to the governors and to the troops, but I believe it was in the one to the governors where he said, the sacred fire of liberty has been entrusted to the American people. So they saw their vision as global at that point. Like, we have this special calling to be like the city on a hill that Winthrop wrote about, with the Puritans and stuff. It's like they had kind of re-grabbed onto that vision that the Puritans had, that we're to set an example for the world. And Jefferson, in my book, I have the closing epilogue is the death of Adams and Jefferson on July 4th, 1826. Yeah. And so he, in his letter to the planners, who they wanted Jefferson to come be at the event in DC for the 50th anniversary. And he said, sorry, I've got declining health, but I do think that the fire that we lit is too big now to be extinguished until it extends to all the globe. And so that's why I made my the subtitle of my book was that the two beliefs that still hold the power to transfer the U.S. and the world. So it's that we have to hold on to both those beliefs in order to retain the founding vision. And those beliefs are God-given rights and a belief in providence, that there's still a God over this world. That's where you get the land of the free and the home of the brave. So they believe that God would be with them when you read the Declaration of Independence. We're appealing to the supreme judge of the universe, said, for the rectitude of our cause, with a firm belief in divine providence. So that was the animating faith that allowed them to step out, even though they had a much smaller military, no navy at the beginning of the war.
Right.
And, but they just believed they were in the right and that God's on the side of the right, and therefore it all will turn out right in the end. That was their deep faith. And of course, they had doubts like anyone does when you set out on something big like that.
Right.
Well, I mean, the theological basis, if you will, of these truths are not necessarily even, I mean, we're Christians, but there's I guess where I'm going with this, is it unique to Christianity, or is it unique to the concept of a God that created us and a God that's passed on inalienable rights? I'll love you to take a stab at that. Or what if, well, let me let you answer that first, then I got to follow up. Go ahead.
No, yeah, that's an interesting question. Of course, now we're dealing with, how does Islam play into this? Because they believe in God also, and people who don't have that sort of faith at all, as far as the belief that there is a creator. But I think you got to look at Benjamin Franklin. Like, he's the classic example. Like, he was raised in a Presbyterian home, and then he grabbed onto the Enlightenment thought and explored. His philosophy was just the belief that you should do good, and that's very Enlightenment, and if you do good deeds, then that's the ultimate end of what any religion's trying to teach you. So he was along those lines. But I think even he, and they portrayed this recently in this movie, A Great Awakening, where he was friends with this evangelist, George Whitefield, from the Great Awakening, which was a religious movement that was in the colonies, 1740s, 50s, 60s even. And they were having all these revival meetings all over the country. And so it gave the colonists kind of something in common. So Christianity all of a sudden became a big deal. And Benjamin Franklin wrote about it in his autobiography. And he said, it seemed like the whole world went from caring less about, religion or whatever, to where that's all they could talk about. And he said you couldn't walk down Philadelphia without hearing songs being sung as you walk down different houses. There are different house meetings going on and whatever. And so he said it had a great effect on the people, like in their manners and just how everyone behaved. So even he, and Jefferson, of course, was an Enlightenment guy too. And he, in his Jefferson Bible, he took out the miracles in his version because he said that was just the extra mythological stuff that they added in to spice up the story. But he believed in the general moral principles that Jesus taught. And so I think, but he was also he attended the Christian services at the Capitol, and he had the Bible as one of the texts in the public schools in D.C. that he was overseeing. And so I think even these kind of Enlightenment people were so affected by Christianity that even if they weren't like a self-professing Christian per se, that they were that was so much of the culture that God just meant the God of the Bible. And when they talked about liberty and everything, that was the context. And now even Thomas Paine, of course, Thomas Paine, he wrote Age of Reason after the war, maybe 15 years after the war. He wrote Age of Reason, and he was trying to show all the reasons why the Bible was inconsistent and why we shouldn't believe in it. And but in Common Sense, his most popular work, he's quoting the Bible left and right. He's like, the Bible says there should be no kings, and just he quoted several passages in Common Sense for the idea that monarchies are a bad idea. That's what the Bible says, and we've got all this history showing where things went awry under monarchies. And so, even in his Crisis series, he was saying, the God of heaven puts a price on liberty, and that price is high. And so anyway, even Thomas Paine, Mr. Enlightenment to the max, was still the Christian context. When he was arguing for the principles of the country, it was in this Christian context. One of the things I go into at the end of my book is just, you do not want church and state to combine. You want them separate. And so the Catholic Church combined with the government, really, certainly in Spain. And so people who were leaders in the church often had to rely on the government to make those appointments, or vice versa. There was a lot of intermixing, and so it corrupt. What I argue is it tends to corrupt both. When you don't have religious liberty, when the purpose of the church is to hold the government accountable to higher ideals, and certainly within our constitutional republic, that means advocating for these ideas and not imposing them by any stretch. Not that we could in our government, where people have a right to vote, but in ages past, it's certainly been true that, and not that the Protestants haven't had their own problems,
Exactly.
but
not hanging this on the Catholics.
yeah, but certainly in the eras you're talking about, like that was, the Inquisition, that was atrocious, but that was a case where you had the church and state, intertwined with each other, where they were not independent institutions. And there were all these fights in Europe. And that's one of the reasons people wanted to come to America, was to get free of the religious wars in Europe and the lack of religious liberty. You either had to toe the state line or you got punished. So there were fights in England, whether it was going to be Catholic or Protestant, and in many of the countries, and after the Reformation, and certainly there were religious wars going on. Are we going to be Catholic, Protestant? And so that was in America. The choice was we were going to be no established Church of America, the Church of the United States, or it wasn't going to be the Catholic Church, and that we were going to be independent. And so each denomination was free. People were free to do what their conscience, by the dictates of their conscience.
And it seems along those lines, in looking at the Founding Fathers and their message, it seems like it's a healthy view to say that it's based on some biblical principles, but it's not a biblical nation. It's a secular nation, and secular values that are based on some biblical principles. And I think, to me, I don't get my guidance and my faith from a political leader. I get it from my pastor, and so, it seems like that's a healthy interpretation. I guess that's all I'm saying.
No, yeah, I'm here in Pennsylvania, and that was when William Penn set up Pennsylvania. It was for the sole purpose that people of all religious backgrounds could come and practice their faith, the Quakers or, the German Lutherans or whomever. And and it was nice that then the nation was founded here. And so those principles kind of spread out. It's interesting, like some of the states did have established religions in a sense. And that wasn't the purview of the federal government under the Constitution. But eventually they went away from these established religions. But, say in Massachusetts or, Maryland was a Catholic state, and North Carolina, I believe, was Presbyterian. So they had established religions in some of the states, but Pennsylvania was one that was all about religious liberty. And of course, eventually all the states went that way, and the federal government certainly set that as the national standard. And
right.
So yeah, we don't have any established religions in any of the states now. Most, if I'm not mistaken, every preamble to every state does have some reference to God, though.
Moving along our 80-year cycle, by the way, I am a huge proponent of that, the Strauss-Howe cyclical theory about this 80-year thing. Let's fast forward from the founding to the next big conflict in the Civil War. It's always surprising to me that because in the lens of the Union victory in the Civil War and the idea that, and one of the things as a Christian of which I'm most proud of American Christianity was the abolitionist movement that drove that. Right? I think we need to give credit there. But the Southern states found biblical endorsement and justification for their own perspective. In other words, they didn't say we're anti-religious and you crazy New England abolitionists are the only, both sides in that conflict really saw a divine mandate. How did that play out in your reading of things?
Well, I was just down at D.C. Last weekend. I got a chance to go visit the White House and the West Wing, so that was fun. I have some friends that work in the at the West Wing, so I had never been in that part of the thing. But then afterwards, I walked over to the World War II and then the Lincoln Memorial, and I went to the Undergroft where they've opened that to the public now. So that was all interesting. But I was, of course, reading the second inaugural address again, where Lincoln said, "We, read the same Bible, pray to the same God." How people could pray that they could wring the bread of another man's labor, is not understandable. Is basically what he said. But let us judge not, lest we be judged. With charity all, malice towards none. So Lincoln, he certainly recognized that there were devout Christians on the southern. Robert E. Lee, by all accounts, was devout.
Sure.
Stonewall
Jackson, for sure. Yeah.
And so the conclusion Lincoln comes to in the second inaugural address, if God wills that, that the end of this thing, this thing has played out its course, that he's given us the Civil War to kind of take every blood, every drop of blood that was drawn from the lash, be drawn by the sword in battle. Who can we judge? The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So I am of this theory that people play their parts in the drama of life, if you will, and he used that language as God gives them to see the right. Let us do the right as God gives us to see the right, and go forward and care for the orphan and all that stuff. So I do think, and of course, the Bible, which is a book of reality, talks about slavery, and Paul's admonishment to slaves was to obey your masters, but if you can get free, get free. I mean, not in other words, if you can legitimately get free, then get free. But so the ideal, the biblical ideal, is freedom, but slavery was an institution, and of course it had gone on for thousands of years. And that's another thing I get into in my book, is that America's history on slavery is actually pretty good in the scope of human history.
Right.
So it's gone on thousands of years, and it's still going on to this day. But at the beginning, in the Revolutionary War era, the states were taking actions to end slavery. So we were the first governments in the world that were doing that. These Pennsylvania, 1780, Vermont was even before that. And all the states north of the Mason-Dixon line ended slavery by 1804, or voted to. And so most of them had gradual plans to try to integrate the slaves back into the society as best they could. So, and then in the Constitution itself, we had provision to end the African slave trade, but the compromise was no earlier than 1808. And so in 1807, they passed the legislation in March of 1807 saying, on January 1st, 1808, we're going to end slavery. And Jefferson signed that legislation into law, by the way.
And slavery, and the trade in
the trade of, I'm sorry, yes,
importation,
the importation of slaves from Africa and West Indies and all that place.
Right.
So, and our legislation was actually signed a couple of weeks before Great Britain. And then, of course, we ended slavery altogether during the Civil War. And Lincoln even said in his Emancipation Address that he believed it was an act of justice before God, and that was the context that he saw it in. So, yeah, I understand that slavery was allowed, but I think Lincoln's interpretation was correct, that it had run its course, and God willed at that point that it was going to end in the U.S. And it already ended in Great Britain and France, I believe. We were among the very first countries that had ended slavery altogether, but we had already taken several steps before that. We didn't allow slavery in the Northwest Territory by a legislation passed in 1787 during the Constitutional Convention time window there. So those were the founders. They were taking actions with the federal government to not allow slavery. So to say that the founders were these slave lovers, obviously a majority of them, and even Jefferson, he wanted that to apply to all the new territories. And he had written legislation in 1784 to that effect, and it fell short in committee by one vote. And that man was sick that day. And so he lamented in a letter, Jefferson did, boy, the heavens were silent, but I know eventually slavery will be outlawed. So, yeah, certainly during the Civil War era, there were still Christians. But as you said, the abolition movement was fueled by Christian people by and large.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to. It's kind of revisionist and difficult to go back and look at people that were Southern plantation holders, that they would immediately be enlightened and work at such a economic out of phase with economic. I mean, I think that whole line of critique of the founders, I think it's valid to say they were slaveholders, but I think that gets a little overblown. I'm more interested in what was the perception of the leaders of the Confederacy. Did they feel that? I assume that they felt that God had called them to secede, and God had called them to create the Confederacy, and like how did that play out, or do you have evidence to that?
I was at an Eric Metaxas event in Phoenix, Scottsdale. He was pushing his new book about the Revolution, and so he said, "Boy, that's a great question," and I wish I had the answer to it, but he had a fun little quip with that. You've asked a very good question, but my sense though of like Robert E. Lee is that that was more of a loyalty to Virginia, I sense, than a loyalty to God. I sense that he thought he had his role to play in this whole thing, and he was trying to be a person of integrity. Jefferson Davis, I know there are books about him, but my sense is that I don't think he did it as much from Christian conviction as he saw it as just this sense of constitutional, there's certainly an argument to be made that the federal government, the states freely joined the federal government and they can freely leave. That was the argument they were making. And so I think in the sense, I'm not an expert. I didn't look at this angle too much, but at all really. But my sense is that it was more Constitution and less God for people like Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and stuff, and the honor of their states. As like Shelby Foote famously said, before the Civil War, it was the United States are, and then after the Civil War, it's the United States is. So it was a state issue more than a God issue.
And I don't know. I think it kind of back to this concept of how our country was founded and how it was led, and it wasn't necessarily led and founded by devout Christians. It was based on biblical principles, and we've got 250 years of very imperfect people trying to make these principles work. I think when I think somebody can be flawed and there's negative elements about them, whether it's their views on, once upon a time, their views on slavery or what have you. Well, it's possible they still do good things. And I fast forward that theorem to today. We got a president that a lot of people say, well, this guy's immoral and yada, 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 and they're not wrong. But is he capable of also doing good things? And to me, if we're putting, to me, it's a mistake for us to try to make our leaders, our political leaders, like, well, I'm only going to vote for this guy if they behave in the way that I want them to behave, or they follow my faith, or what have you. Like, you pick these leaders based on who you think is going to get the job done like you like it. And it seems like it's been that way forever. I mean, curious your thoughts there, Randy.
No, yeah, I think Lincoln, he was a rational thinker, and so I think he had a lot of doubts about religion. And the general belief is that he became a Christian during the course of the Civil War, and made that profession. I guess they said after Gettysburg is kind of when he kind of came to a place like that, or at least some of the biographers think that. So I think he had he'd certainly been influenced by the Second Great Awakening, which was happening in Kentucky and throughout the country. But so he wasn't a Christian in the traditional sense, except maybe in the last year or two of his life. And so he was elected. I don't think he was a Christian when he was elected. Some people would broadly probably say, yeah, he, maybe attended church and stuff, but he did start consistently and going to church during the Civil War. And then, I think of people like Winston Churchill. I think he said something like, I consider myself one of the outside pillars of like he was kind of outside of it and supporting it, but not, inside and part of it. But yet, when you listen to some of his speeches, he uses very Christian-esque language, and he saw the World War II as a battle between Christendom and, godlessness, basically, Hitler. And so, yeah, you don't have to be a Christian to use the principles that I write about in the book or to help uphold them. And I think Trump, he's probably a Christian, but obviously he has his language is not the best sometimes. But of course, neither is mine when I have my moments. But I almost see him like a Winston Churchill or a Lincoln or somebody like that who he sees the importance of Christianity in society and the importance of faith. And he may be a believer himself. I think he would call himself a Christian, and he may be, but he's certainly a supporter of faith, and in a big ways, like he had called for the national rededication to God, and it happened to fall on the 250th anniversary of during the Revolutionary War, when they had a call to prayer and fasting, when a tough, in 1775 or 1776, as they were having to make difficult decisions. They hadn't declared independence yet. And so it just happened to fall on that day. I don't think they planned it. They just planned it for a Sunday. And then, and it was May 17th, which I'd written about in the first edition of my book. And so I was pleased. And then I was able to add in the second edition that he had called for that day to be a day of prayer.
You just hit something that is interesting that I honestly hadn't thought much about before, and that is Churchill describing World War II as, I can't remember the words you said, but placed it in a religious or at least a principled.
No, he used Christian, yeah.
Did he? Yeah. So, but what's interesting is, in hindsight, after the liberation of the camps and right, like the manifest evil of the Nazis is just so. I mean, almost like, it's a truism on the internet, right? Like anytime a conversation goes bad, it winds up going. You compare someone to Nazi.
Yeah, Nazi.
Like it's a stereotype of just the absolute worst. How, during that World War II crisis era, though, was that a prominent belief in this country that this was is this a moral cause? Or, because there was a lot of ambiguity about the Nazis early. Again, I'm not talking late stage. But there were a lot of business people that that saw the trains running on time and thought that was a great thing, right? Like,
yeah.
Thoughts on that, World War II?
Well, no, like when you look at, and I wrote an article about this a little while ago, but both FDR and Churchill framed the battle of the fight against Hitler as a fight, against, they talked about the pre-Christian ages. Like, we haven't seen anything like this since the pre-Christian ages, where he was acting so outside the norms of respecting humanity and the right to people to live and it was I think Churchill called it a revival of barbarism is what happened in Nazi Germany. And that rivals anything since the pre-Christian ages, he said. And FDR was saying very similar things. And he was making calls to prayer and things like that in the lead up to the war. And of course, he famously prayed on D-Day, and he used that sort of language even in that prayer on D-Day, where he was talking about putting down the evils. And then Justice Jackson, who was a Supreme Court justice, he took a leave of absence to be a prosecutor in Nuremberg. Mm-hmm. And he used that same sort of thing. He said, the question before this tribunal is, how do we judge these people if they were just obeying orders? And he said, his conclusion was, even he quoted Lord Coke, who was a famous British jurist, who said, even the king is under God and the law. In other words, there are certain truths, certain rights that we recognize in this Christian era, and they stepped way outside of them. And they can be judged based on these common principles, these truths, and found wanting. They can be weighed in the balance and found wanting. And so, yeah, it was very much. And if you like, I quote, I have a chapter or two on Douglas MacArthur, and he loved he loved to talk about Christianity, and some would accuse him of having a little bit of a messianic complex. But people of the Philippines, I have returned.
I'm back.
And by the grace of Almighty God. And so he spoke like that, and I loved it. I lived in MacArthur Barracks, and I thought he was good stuff. He was a great orator. He spoke in very Victorian, grandiose terms, and but he definitely, as the Victorians were famous for, he did talk about Christianity and the Bible, and so, and even Eisenhower, who's more of a, what would you say, reserved guy, and not wanting to put religion on the sleeve, and he didn't like drama. He didn't like the dramatics of MacArthur. He worked for MacArthur for about 10 years, and one of the things he didn't like about MacArthur was his dramatic poses and his overly flowery language and all that stuff. But he even talked about these sort of things in his D-Day order to the troops that they were fighting to maintain civilization, and good luck. Let us all beseech the blessings of Almighty God in this great and noble undertaking. So they definitely saw it that way. Patton saw it that way. In his famous prayer, he had his chaplain drafted a prayer, and those were the sentiments of that prayer, that we would be able to defeat the unholy forces of the Nazis and establish thy justice among men and nations, was the closing of the prayer.
So as you fast forward another 80 years, what do you see in today's society as the biggest threats to the principles the Founding Fathers espoused?
Well, it's interesting. When the 2007 book came out, my original version of this, it seemed like the Supreme Court was kind of going off the rails, and like they wouldn't allow even the display of, say, the Ten Commandments in a public setting, and the God-given rights we enjoy, like the right to life, is right in the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not kill. The right to property. Thou shalt not steal. Or covet. Thou shalt not covet, which also have to do with property. So I saw the removal of these ideals from the public square as kind of the biggest threat, and in the legal system, and it certainly in education too, that people weren't being taught that this is the basis of our laws. That if they can't even put these displays up in public buildings, how can they talk about it in our schools when they should be talking about it, just as a fair education to the country? And so, and I certainly went back to the idea we used to have Bible reading in the schools, and I guess I'm kind of happy that there's no mandatory Bible reading, but as a devotion. But the Bible should be taught as literature and the impact that it had on the liberties in this country, and so that's a legitimate teaching. And the Supreme Court, even in these cases that pulled prayer and religion from school, said, yeah, certainly you got to be able to teach the Bible as one of the most, well, probably the most influential book in human history. I think it has to be. And so that's what I saw. The threats then were just a lack of knowledge. Reagan, in his farewell address, he had a line along those lines where he said, we've seen a revival of the American spirit in the 1980s, which I'm really grateful for, that it happened during my presidency and all this stuff. I'm paraphrasing now. But I'm concerned that we haven't institutionalized why we should be proud to be Americans, and that it's not being taught in our schools. And he said, I'm talking about the loss of knowledge that could mean the eradication of the American spirit, the American liberty. And so I open that in the foreword to this edition of the book, where I quote those words, precisely what he says. But that was the big danger then, and that's the big danger now as we see socialism so popular among the younger set. It's just they don't understand that when you give government more power, that means less liberty. And when you demand more the more we pay in taxes, the less choices that people have. And so we have to be very aware of the trade-offs of the bigger we make the government, the less likely. Charlie Kirk wanted
well,
yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, Charlie Kirk said he had two issues that help people, when they're trying to say if they think they're socialists. He's like, "Well, you trust the government?" And he says, usually they say no. Then why do you want to make the government bigger? And so he says, usually that short little exchange along those lines gets a lot of people to say, well, then I guess I don't want to be a socialist. People just want more benefits, obviously, and medical insurance is a big deal. That's a tough one.
Well, I mean, to me though, it's less of the taxes and it's actually more the benefits. There's been, and I'm not saying I'm against getting value for our money, but like when you look at many European countries where they're not totalitarian socialist regimes yet, but they're the government's taking 67% of your income and you're getting all this stuff provided. But in many of those countries, Christianity is practiced less and less, and it's almost becomes like the religion of the government. What do I need God for? I've got the big government that's going to provide for me, and that to me is one of the hazards. There is that we see the government as our provider.
Yeah, no, I think when faith decreases, then something moves into the void. So it takes a certain amount of faith just to kind of launch out in life and make your way. And so if the government's there, promising you all these things, then there can be less of an incentive to take risks and to start a business or try to if you're the more and more that government provides, the less incentive there is to kind of take a risk and get out there. So I like the idea, like unemployment insurance and some of these things are, obviously we want things that help people when, life takes an unexpected turn. And I like unemployment insurance. They'll if you're part-time. So if you can find part-time work, that was my experience when I went through in 2008 when the crash happened. I was temporarily unemployed. And so I appreciated the fact that they created an incentive that once I found, first I was able to find some part-time work where I was able to go a couple days a week and they would then pay the rest of, that. So I earned some of it and then they paid the rest. So I think programs that kind of incentivize people when they get into a bad way to lift themselves out of that, because obviously they never paid me as much as I could earn in a reasonable job, but it was those sort of stopgaps or helps that people need at times. I think that's good and reasonable, but we don't want to create such a benefit class that there's no incentive to look for a better job or, and of course we know, I mean, there's a whole discussion to be had on medical. We've had this debate a couple times now, but if we say Medicare for all, that means Canada really, or Great Britain, which means ration care when you get down to it. And
well, we often talk about that. We already have socialized medicine.
Yeah.
You walk into the ER, you're getting served. So, Kent, come on, we need a liberal voice here. We're just spouting on the party lines over here.
Well, it's interesting. So I would class myself as a pretty conventional Democrat. I've said in our previous discussions, I'm worried a little bit about the rise of, I'm going to put in quotes, democratic socialism, and the Mamdani phenomenon, and now our home state of Michigan, the fellow that won the primary there. But I take a little bit of a longer view in that I believe, Randy, I think you're absolutely right. If you ask people, how does socialism sound to you, that the government takes a heavier hand and provides some of the things, I think that's probably really attractive to people, especially people that don't have a long lens of history to look at, right? They're looking at their budgets. And you mentioned healthcare. The other things that I see that are top of agenda for people, childcare, it's a big deal, right? And so, but to your point, if Charlie Kirk would say to people, well, do you trust the government? Well, no. And like that thing. I feel like with the debate about socialism, though, we're not talking enough about what's driving it. And I think that's inflation, like insane inflation especially on some fronts, the need for people to have things like childcare that people go broke over healthcare bills. Yeah. And especially in this AI era, candidly, I'm a little worried. I'm less worried about our country sliding into socialism. I'm worried about kind of a plutocracy that we've got going on. And I'm interested in your lens from history, because I feel like we're at sort of a precarious moment. Franklin Roosevelt, like we grew up in a very conservative household. Our great-grandmother wouldn't change her clocks for daylight savings time because that was Roosevelt time. So, I came up with that lens of Roosevelt as really, bringing all this socialist stuff in. But the truth is that Roosevelt, for all of his flaws and all the flaws of the New Deal, was able to thread a needle in a world that was falling off of a edge into fascism on one end and off to communism on the other, and was able to help, I think, navigate that for our country, not alone, but with a lot of help. I feel sort of a similar precariousness right now that, socialism sounds good if all you know about it is that, like,
more government.
Or that your health care, you don't have to have your health care bills. I feel like we are underweighting the risks of the concentration of wealth and plutocracy. And I'm not a socialist. I'm not a redistributive kind of a person. But there's a reason that billionaire tax in California, I think it's a bad idea, but there's a reason that's driving that.
Yeah, I think it's, I was just having this discussion at dinner with some people regarding FDR. And so I said, I have to give him some slack, even though conservatives don't like him, because like you said, what was the world at that point? You had communists and fascists going for each other, and somehow he was able to thread the needle and just let the country move, somewhat into socialist direction. Certainly Social Security got started, and other government programs, but most of them, Social Security is the longest lasting one, and then eventually Medicare was added on in the 60s. But I don't fault him too much for that. I think that his policies prolonged the Great Depression. High tax. It's a bad idea. What they were trying to do, and this gets to more to your point, I guess, but they were trying to level it out. So and I don't know the exact breakoffs at that time, and it wouldn't translate now because of inflation, but say the first 30,000 that you earned back then, everyone was taxed at the same level, and then as you earned more and more money, they kept taking more and more away until over a certain threshold, maybe it was 100,000 or which would be say $1 million or more today, they taxed you at 90%, and that's destructive of capitalism. And it was this idea that we were going to use the government to kind of equalize things and make sure Roosevelt wanted to issue his own Bill of Rights that basically guaranteed everybody food, housing, education. He had his own Bill of Rights, and that was never implemented, but that was his idea. And I think that does, well, for one thing, it does hurt people. You don't want to disincentivize. You want the wealthy people to take the money that they earn and reinvest it. And like Elon Musk, he's the trillionaire, and he employs over 100,000 people. And of course, his businesses, those are just his direct employees. God knows how many jobs he's responsible for because his companies are out there. We need this for our Tesla, or we need that for our rocket. And so all these companies are making things that they need and employing people who have families, and they get benefits. And so the multiplication effect of a wealthy man like him, or Apple, or Microsoft, any of those, Bill Gates, all those people, is that, they start these massive industries, and then that are filled with taxpayers and then you can build families, and anything and if you're trying to just confiscate that wealth, they won't create more wealth. And those sort of people will go to some place where they can fulfill the dreams, the God-given creativity that's been put within them. So they'll go to maybe Singapore or wherever they need to go to, where they have freedom to do that. And so you lose those people. And even we've seen that even within the United States, where wealthy people are moving to Florida or Texas, and because of the tax structure and the fact that they can grow their businesses without all the regulations and all the things that California tries to do to fulfill their utopian dream with, with their generous benefit programs. And I guess they're running I think they had to go into, I know they had a deficit they needed to correct this year. And so it's, so the idea of a wealth tax is a bad idea. Of course, you just chase away the wealthy people. Then New York State and New York City in particular have been doing that for years. Here they are, the financial capital of the world, and they're chasing wealthy people away. And then they elect Mandami, who's going to even put that on steroids, where people just,
hey, we're just going to fix the prices of groceries, okay? I mean, I don't see anything going wrong there. I mean, it worked great for Chavez.
Yeah, and I've heard there's a Dan, I don't remember his last name, but he came from Venezuela. He's been a speaker going around the country, the Young America's Foundation events and others. And I heard him speak at an event in Scottsdale, where he grew up in Venezuela, and he so he knows it firsthand. I'd say he's a man, and it was about 30-ish now. And so and I think he's gone to law school at this point, but he kind of said the steps that they, like Mandami and those other, I just saw him speaking recently on it, these are the kind of things, exactly the kind of things they were doing in Venezuela. And the same thing when the DSA, the Democrat Socialists, they talk about, packing the court or getting rid of the Senate. That's what Hugo Chavez did. Like when the Supreme Court of Venezuela started to try to oppose some of his takeovers of private property and stuff, he just, changed the composition of the court so that they would allow it to go through. FDR, of course, famously tried to do that, and that's one of the black marks on his legacy, is that thankfully it wasn't successful. But
well, I honestly, I mean, I think it's great Mamdani is doing this, because it's not going to work, and people are going to see an object lesson in economics play out over the next few years. So it'll be good.
No, I think you're right. That's the great thing. Yeah, there's quotes that you need a few socialists and liberals around just to remind people how bad their ideas are. You've got to, especially socialists, and not trying to down any ideas you might have, Ken, but
I'm the comic relief here. I don't want to belabor this, but I am interested. When you this wealth concentration thing, and part of this theme that we've been tracing is the way that Christian values have, be careful, I don't want to put words in your mouth, the way Christian values have inspired and infused over the course of American history. It's not lost on me that at another time when we had what I would call runaway wealth inequity during the Gilded Age, you also had people like John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie, who were people of faith themselves, and their Christian faith. I mean, the reason we've still got a Rockefeller University and a Rockefeller Brothers Fund and a Rockefeller Foundation was because of Christian principles guiding that. What recourse do we or should we have as a society? I hear you on job creation. I'm with you on that, but is it ever worrisome when wealth concentrates to the degree that we've got it?
Well, and before he answers, I mean, I would jump in. Like, would Rockefeller, would the university system and everything have worked out as well if the government had taken the money from Rockefeller and put it into a fund than if he'd have done it himself? So maybe that's another question.
Yeah, no, of course, I live here in Pittsburgh, and Carnegie Hall or Carnegie. There's different there's Carnegie universities out in Pittsburgh, and so yeah, Pennsylvania is definitely a beneficiary of some of these. Of course, the textbooks would call them, I don't know, maybe robber barons or something. But,
right.
but no, these were visionary people, and Teddy Roosevelt. There was a populist reaction to the concentration of wealth and the concentration of power in just a few key businesses. So I think that's a good tension. That he was the trust buster. He went in like Standard Oil and some of these that were able to kind of just monopolize the market. You don't want that. You want true competition, and that's what keeps prices lower. So yes, I think there's certainly a role in government for that, and there have been some lawsuits against Gates and others, and they've had to adjust, and that's probably good. And it seems like there's a decent amount of competition in AI. The search engines, Google's faced some of those. They've kind of monopolized that whole arena of internet search engines and stuff to a large degree. So yeah, I think there's a role in government for that sort of populism. I just am not comfortable with. I think it's okay that as many billionaires or trillionaires as can be created. I think it's so funny. Like Bernie Sanders, for years he would say millionaires, and then he became a millionaire, and then it was billionaires, and then, and now he talks about, he seems to direct a lot of his fire at Elon Musk. We shouldn't be a society that allows trillionaires. It's like, well, of course you should. He's created these businesses that are, space. Who would think of a private individual that we should have a space exploration company, and and to be able to accumulate that much wealth that's phenomenal. And then to have the most American-made car is Tesla, as I understand it, as far as American components and everything. And so, yeah, I have no opposition to as many people as can become millionaires, billionaires, trillionaires. Trump has taken the view that, and this is the Kennedy view too, the famous statement that a rising tide floats all boats. So, like, I was just dealing with this in a story on Western Journal, where I was saying, the title of the story was, what do Jesus and Bible say about socialism? And one of the things I cited was Jesus and the parable of the talents. And it's interesting, one guy was given 5, and one guy was given 2, and one guy was given 1. And that's true in life. Some people have more talent than others. And Jesus commended the guy with the 5 for taking his talents and doubling it. And the one with the 2 talents did the same thing. And then the one with the 1 talent, he admonished. He's like, you could have at least invested it in the bank and gotten some return.
Buy a CD.
Yeah. And so, but you did nothing. You just buried your talent. And he said, take that talent from him and give it to the guy the billionaire, if you will, the 10 talent guy. And so Jesus commended industry. And so I think, we want to encourage people to just reach and go as far as they can. And that I think most people understand that the people who pay taxes in this country are the top 10%. And the bottom 50% of wage earners, now I know this includes just part-time jobs and all this stuff, but the bottom 50% pay 3% of all federal income tax revenue. And the top 10% pay 70-some%. So the wealthy are paying, certainly a lot of more than their fair share, I would say. But I think it's reasonable to have a graduated income tax, to some level. But I think once you hit kind of that half level, like California does because of their high state tax, that's too much. You're disincentivizing people from working and taking risks, and you're, like you said, you're taking capital away from them, which they could use to create more jobs, and you're spreading it out to, of course, many programs that are probably 10 or 20% fraud payouts, and the more generous you make the benefits, the more the incentive is to have fraudsters come in. So,
well, looking at a ChatGPT calculation, if George Washington would have sacked away his $20 million in a IRA, and after the Declaration of Independence time frame, at 7% interest over the last 250 years, he'd be worth $450 trillion. So hey, maybe those founding fathers figured out how to build some wealth as well as building a nation. Hey, Randy, we really appreciate your time. We're coming up on over an hour here. We really appreciate the time that you spent with us. And this was really enlightening for us. We enjoyed the dialogue. And, we had some disagreements back and forth, but we appreciate you sticking with the spirit of our civil discourse. And I think we both learned a lot. Kent, you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I've appreciated it very much. And it's interesting to watch the arc of history. I think at least for us, the thing that keeps us honest on this is that ultimately we want to see our nation thrive. Sometimes we disagree about what that next step ought to be, but I think that we are aligned on what the long-term vision and goal is. And so we enjoy this dialogue, and it's really been a pleasure to have you a part of it tonight.
Thank you, Kent and Kyle, both.
Well, best of luck on the book, and I have to admit I didn't know much about the Western Journal until this episode. Now I'm a subscriber now, so.
Oh, good.
And
I don't know that Ken will be, but I am.
I should say an Audible version of the book is just coming out too.
Cool.
Oh, great.
So it may not be on Audible just yet. It should be in the next few days, but it's on some of the other platforms. And John Pruden, who did American Sniper, is the guy who voiced my book, and he's done many other prominent authors. So I appreciated him agreeing to do it.
Very cool. Well, we will link in our show notes to where they can find your book and also where they can find your articles in Western Journal. I know our listeners will enjoy having heard this discussion and will want to look that up as well. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for joining us on this episode of Bourbon and Rum Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Remember to subscribe on your favorite platform and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us keep the good spirits flowing.
And we invite you to join this conversation. Follow us on our Facebook page. Let us know what you think. Let us know what you want to hear.
And until next time, cheers.